9 medieval queens who had the most disturbing physical deformities. The abdomen of the Queen of England swelled for 11 months, only to suddenly deflate, leaving behind nothing but a cold, empty void. A biological tumor had deceived an entire empire. Royal portraits always cast a luminous glow over velvet and crowns, but behind them lay misaligned skeletons, rotting teeth, and contorted, deformed hands. In many European courts, physical disability was not merely physiological pain, it was weaponized into a political tool, branded as a mark of the devil, and used as an excuse to crush a queen's reputation. Unsealing the medical files and diplomatic dispatches of these 9 women will expose how royal bodies were scrutinized, distorted, and exploited as instruments of power manipulation. Luxurious fashion items were sometimes not symbols of beauty, but rather camouflage concealing deformities that the entire court desperately tried to hide. Number 1. Anne Boleyn, rumored to have a 6th finger. In the 1530s, the Tudor court possessed virtually no concept of privacy. Every single movement of a queen was observed, memorized, and gossiped about. And amidst the oak-paneled corridors of the palace, a rumor began to spread Anne Boleyn had a 6th finger. Certain documents from opposing factions described her as having a small piece of flesh and a nail growing right next to the pinky of her right hand. To the conservative aristocracy and foreign ambassadors, that detail quickly became the most scrutinized topic whenever Anne appeared at banquets. They stared intently at the long, wide sleeves she frequently wore. A highly popular Tudor fashion trend was suddenly interpreted as a tool to conceal a deformity. From there, the rumor continued to swell. Opposing texts even claimed Anne had a large mole or a fleshy growth on her neck, something they called a witch's mark. In the 16th century, Europe was still deeply submerged in the belief that the body reflected the soul. A flawed body was often viewed as a sign of a deviant nature or a connection to witchcraft. Therefore, Anne's high-collared dresses and tight chokers were weaponized as evidence of a cover-up. But when modern historians re-examined the records, the story began to unravel. The most famous description of the 6th finger comes from Nicholas Sander, a Catholic scholar hostile to Anne. More importantly, he wrote that in 1585, decades after she had lost her power and been executed. No contemporary portrait depicts a deformed hand. No royal medical record confirms it. But when a powerful woman falls from grace, her body often becomes the repository where the public dumps all their fears and prejudices. An extra finger was a far simpler explanation for the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn than the complex political conspiracies orchestrating the Tudor court. The rumor of the 6th finger might have never existed outside the imagination of her contemporaries. But in another dynasty, there was a queen who genuinely bore a visible physical flaw in every step she took, and how she hid it inadvertently changed the history of global fashion. Number 2. Catherine de' Medici, uneven legs and an abnormal gait. The 16th century French court was obsessed with physical perfection. Posture, the way one walked. Every minor movement in the Great Hall was seen as a reflection of power and noble blood. And Catherine de' Medici stepped into that world with a defect she had to hide. For almost her entire life, one leg was shorter than the other. Diplomatic records of the era repeatedly mention Catherine's asymmetrical gait as she walked down the long, stone-paved corridors of the Louvre. The sound she made was uneven compared to other nobles, a heavy thud of a heel striking the stone, followed by a light, slightly delayed, and unbalanced drag. in a court where hundreds of eyes were always tracking the Queen's every step. That limp quickly became a topic of hushed whispers. Some servants even recounted that Catherine rarely stood still for too long during major ceremonies. Her body tended to lean slightly to one side to relieve the pressure on her hips and spine. After hours of attending banquets or religious rituals, she often had to grip the arm of a chair before moving again. The uneven gait wasn't just an aesthetic issue, it forced her entire skeletal frame to bear an unbalanced load with every step. But Catherine refused to let her body become a political weakness. She sought out Italian shoemakers to create a specialized type of footwear. The heel of the shorter leg was elevated using multiple layers of cork and hard wood to balance her body while moving. Some early designs were so heavy that they produced a distinct clacking sound against the stone floors. They weren't created to be beautiful. They were more akin to orthopedic devices than fashion. That elevated block forced Catherine's spine and pelvis back into a more balanced position, evening out her shoulders and giving her a more commanding posture before the crowd. But in return, her feet had to endure unnaturally immense pressure. Royal wardrobe documents reveal she frequently suffered from aching ankles and swollen feet after prolonged public appearances. Then, the court saw it. The taller stature, the straighter posture. Catherine's less erratic stride was quickly misunderstood by the French aristocracy as a new fashion trend. Noble ladies began demanding shoemakers raise their heels to mimic the Queen's silhouette, a solution designed to conceal a physical deformity. Somehow, became the predecessor of the European high heel. The bizarre thing is that the crowd never saw the physical agony beneath that velvet and silk. They only saw a more powerful posture, unaware that it was erected upon a skeleton desperately trying to correct its own imbalance every single day. High heels can hide a limping gait, but there are signs of decay that no silk or leather can conceal, especially when the rotting begins from deep inside the body. Number 3. Joanna of Castile, severely decayed teeth. For centuries, Joanna of Castile has often been remembered by the moniker Joanna the Mad. But surviving documents from the castle of Tordesillas, where she was isolated for over 40 years, reveal that Joanna's deterioration wasn't confined to her mind. It was glaringly visible on her body. Guards and servants recorded that Joanna almost entirely refused personal hygiene for prolonged periods. Her body slowly but continuously descended into a state of severe degradation. Her hair became matted in clumps, her nails grew long and discolored, but the most haunting part lay inside her mouth. Her teeth turned dark brown, as if roasted from the inside. Some cracked vertically and shattered into tiny fragments the moment she chewed food. Her gums were constantly red and inflamed, swelling around the roots of her teeth like patches of necrotic tissue. There were periods when Joanna could barely bite into hard food because even the slightest pressure sent agonizing pain shooting through her jaw. A few descriptions even mentioned that when she spoke. The disappearing dark gaps between the roots of her teeth created the illusion that her oral cavity was collapsing from the inside. This was no longer the image of a queen. It resembled the body of someone whose living parts were being silently eaten away by bacteria. But the most haunting aspect was not visual. It was the smell. Many records describe Joanna's breath as being so heavy that those entering her room could recognize it instantly, even before seeing her. It was the stench of necrotic tissue and prolonged infection, a smell that made the body of a living person resemble a corpse, slowly decomposing behind layers of royal gowns. Some servants even tried to keep their distance when handing her food, not out of courtly etiquette, but because the odor from Joanna's mouth lingered heavily in the enclosed air of the stone chamber. In early 16th century Europe, such conditions were rarely viewed through a medical lens. People believed the body reflected the state of the soul. A rotting body was often seen as a sign of spiritual decay or something unnatural, devouring human vitality from within. Joanna was not born with any deformities. Her body simply collapsed under years of isolation, exhaustion, and severe neglect. And sometimes, the first thing to betray a human being's dissolution is their very own teeth. Rotting teeth is a form of destruction visible day by day. But in another European court, a body began to swell in a way that made the entire royal family believe a new life was forming until everything suddenly deflated, exposing a reality far more abnormal. Number 4. Mary I of England, the tumor of a non-existent pregnancy. Sometimes, the human body can construct a biological illusion so complete that even the person living inside it believes it to be real. In 1554, the body of Mary I of England began to change, displaying every sign of a pregnancy. Her abdomen grew month by month. Her royal gowns had to be constantly widened at the waist. Water retention caused her ankles and hands to visibly swell. Her typically angular face became rounder and taut due to fluids held beneath the skin. Attendants recorded that Mary often placed her hands on her belly for long periods, as if feeling the life inside. She told her physicians she felt small movements beneath the skin, like kicks, that everyone believed were signs of the child about to be born. At certain points, her breasts even changed in accordance with the exact hormonal reactions of a genuinely pregnant woman. Her entire body acted as though it were pregnant. And the terrifying part was that her brain believed it too. All of England immediately prepared for the birth of an heir to the throne. A birthing chamber was set up with heavy drapes and a fire burning day and night. Midwives stood on constant standby outside. European courts sent congratulatory letters prematurely, as if the child already existed. But then the 9th month passed. No labor pains. The 10th month, then the 11th. The doors of the birthing chamber remained sealed in silence, and Mary's body began to transform in a way that bewildered everyone around her. The abdomen, once round and taut as if holding a life, gradually and grotesquely deflated. At times, it felt soft and mushy, as if filled with fluid. At others, it was hard and immobile, like a dead mass lying in her abdominal cavity. Today, many researchers believe Mary may have suffered from a phantom pregnancy pseudocyesis, or carried a massive ovarian cyst that caused severe hormonal disruption. Her body was not nurturing a fetus. It was inflating itself with fluids and abnormal tissue growth inside her abdomen. But in the 16th century, no one understood that. Rumors spread across London that the Queen had been pregnant with a demon, a monkey, or some deformed creature, and had secretly lost it before the due date. Some even believed her belly held something non-human, because no one had ever seen a pregnancy last that long without a child emerging. The crowd did not see a body collapsing from endocrine disruption and soft tissue pathology. They only saw a belly that had once swelled like the symbol of power for an entire dynasty, slowly deflating in silence, leaving behind no cry of a newborn child. A tumor can be hidden beneath layers of royal dresses, but if the abnormality lies right on the face in the exact place others are forced to look during conversation, it transforms into a psychological weapon far more dangerous. Number 5. Margaret of Anjou, eyes twisted into the mark of the devil. In the Middle Ages, power did not reside solely in crowns or armies. Sometimes, A face alone was enough to strike fear into others. Margaret of Anjou stepped into the Wars of the Roses with a physical feature frequently mentioned by rival historians: unusually deep-set eyes. Her eye sockets were sharply sunken into her frontal bone, creating natural dark hollows around her gaze. When candlelight or torchlight struck from above, the area around Margaret's eyes was almost completely swallowed by shadows, making her pupils look deeper and colder than normal. That face created the sensation that she was always staring intensely at the person opposite her, even when showing no emotion. Some records also describe her habit of holding eye contact for very long periods during conversations. No bowing of the head, no averting her gaze. In a society where noblewomen were expected to be soft and demure, that direct, unyielding stare was viewed as something abnormal. When war erupted, Margaret's appearance was immediately weaponized as propaganda. To many English people of the time, a woman participating in military command was already hard to accept. So, instead of describing Margaret as a strategist, Yorkist chroniclers began to construct her image as something closer to an unnatural creature than a human being. They called her eyes the devil's eyes. Some guards whispered among themselves that one should not look directly into her eyes for too long, lest they have their life force drained. Hostile scribes continuously emphasized Margaret's dark, unblinking, and metallic cold gaze, as if it were indisputable proof of her cruelty. What is noteworthy is that this fear did not stem from any actual deformity. It was created by her facial bone structure, dark circles from sleep deprivation, and years of living under the crushing pressure of war, but under the flickering torches of a medieval great hall. Those deep sockets were enough to make anyone facing her feel they were speaking to something beyond the normal boundaries of a woman of that era. A few extreme descriptions even likened her face to a skull draped in thin skin, where her dark eyes appeared as two bottomless pits, staring straight through the person opposite her. The more she was feared, the more Margaret's image was distorted through every whispered tale. But in reality, Margaret possessed no supernatural traits whatsoever. What unsettled people wasn't necessarily her eyes, it was the fact that a woman was looking at them with the exact same level of power as a man. People can turn deep-set eyes into the mark of the devil. But in the next dynasty, there was a queen who actively turned her own body into an instrument of self-mutilation just to maintain a symbol of beauty revered by all of Europe. Number 6. Elizabeth of Austria. Hair as heavy as shackles. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, or Sisi, was once considered the epitome of 19th century European beauty. But behind the flawless portraits was a body controlled to the point of near self-mutilation. Her most haunting feature was her hair, which cascaded almost to her ankles. In paintings, it looked like a luxurious river of black silk. In real life, it was a massive, physical dead weight hanging off the body of a living person. When soaked in water, the hair became so heavy it aggressively yanked her scalp backward, placing continuous, agonizing pressure on her neck and shoulders. Her ladies-in-waiting recounted that, after every hair wash, Elizabeth would often lie in a dark room for hours, incapacitated by violent migraines. Caring for that hair was more akin to a forced ritual than a beauty routine. It took hours just to brush, detangle, and apply oils. If a few strands fell onto the brush, she could fly into a rage or plunge into extreme distress. At times, her hair was so thick that when let down, it covered almost her entire back and legs like a living, suffocating cloak. But the more extreme aspect lay in her body itself. Elizabeth was so obsessed with a tiny waist that she lived in a state of prolonged starvation. Her corsets were laced so tightly that her lower ribs were crushed inward, permanently deforming her rib cage over time. Servants described that when she removed the corset. Deep, purplish-red indentations stretched across her waist and abdomen, looking like the ligature marks of a metal cage. Her body was so emaciated that many of her joints protruded sharply through her skin. Her wrists were abnormally small. Her collarbones jutted out like sharp blades beneath her silk dresses. At certain points, Elizabeth's waist was recorded as being so small it was biologically disproportionate to the natural skeletal frame of an adult. Modern medical evaluations often equate that lifestyle with severe anorexia nervosa. The public saw an almost surreal symbol of beauty. But behind the hair famous across Europe was a body existing in a permanent state of exhaustion, malnutrition, and forced to survive within standards no human could withstand. Some turned their own bodies into prisons due to an obsession with perfection. But, for other queens, the abnormality was present from birth, resting right on the hands that the entire court was forced to look at every single day. Number 7. Berengaria of Navarre. Contorted hands and the fear of witchcraft. Royal histories often try to conceal flaws that might diminish the image of the monarchy. But folk tales do the exact opposite. They remember physical abnormalities on the human body for a very long time. Berengaria of Navarre, the queen consort of Richard the Lionheart, appears in several oral traditions with descriptions of unnaturally contorted hands. Her fingers were said to be bent at angles that were difficult to straighten, especially when gripping objects or raising her hands during royal ceremonies. In a court where every gesture carried political weight, those hands became something very difficult to hide. When other nobles raised their goblets or placed their hands over their hearts with graceful, fluid motions, Berengaria's hands were perceived as perpetually rigid and distorted. Some descriptions even mention abnormally enlarged knuckles protruding beneath thin skin, creating the impression of folded bone hooks rather than the hands of a queen. Today, this might simply be diagnosed as a form of joint contracture or a congenital deformity. But in medieval Europe, a deformed body was rarely viewed through the lens of medicine. A contorted hand was easily twisted into a sign of witchcraft. Whispers began to circle the image of Berengaria's twisted fingers. In the consciousness of the era, the body reflected the soul. If the bones were misaligned, people believed that something unnatural existed within that person. Some rumors even claimed she frequently hid her hands inside overly long gloves or excessively draped sleeves. That act of concealment alone was enough to make the crowd's imagination swell even further. To them, what is unseen is always far more terrifying than what is clearly visible. What is noteworthy is that there is almost no concrete evidence regarding the true extent of this deformity. But the very fact that the rumors persisted for centuries reveals a different reality. If a queen's body deviated from the norm even slightly, society would automatically morph it into something vastly more monstrous. Bent fingers could still be hidden under gloves and long sleeves. But in the next court, the abnormality was glaring across the entire body, so emaciated that the bones almost pierced through the skin, creating an image that led her contemporaries to call her by a chilling name, the she-wolf. Number 8. Isabella of France, a skeleton beneath black velvet. In the imagination of medieval royalty, power was usually associated with full, robust bodies. But Isabella of France appeared as the exact opposite. The woman whispered about under the moniker She-Wolf of France possessed a figure so gaunt it sent a cold chill through anyone standing near her. Many contemporary records describe her collarbones and shoulder blades jutting sharply beneath her dark velvet gowns. When Isabella leaned forward under the candlelight, her bone structure appeared so stark it looked as if it wanted to pierce right through her pale skin. Her deeply hollowed cheeks ensured her face was always cast in bizarre, shifting shadows whenever torchlight swept across the great hall. At one point, her frame was so emaciated that nobles described the sensation that her royal dresses were hanging on a skeletal frame rather than draping over a living body. Isabella's long, cold fingers only heightened that sense of abnormality. Some records even noted that the skin on her hands was so deathly pale it almost lost all color under the winter light, making her hands look more like wax than real flesh. As Isabella walked through the stone corridors of the palace, the rustle of multiple layers of silk and velvet rubbing together sounded almost heavier than the body carrying them. This created a very eerie feeling for those standing close. A powerful dress was moving, but the body inside it was too small and consumed. In 14th century Europe, extreme emaciation was often viewed as a sign of something unnatural. The crowd of that era found it hard to believe that a woman with a fragile, almost lifeless body could manipulate politics and overthrow royal power with sheer coldness. And Isabella inadvertently turned that very appearance into a psychological weapon. Her sharp, bony face, deeply sunken eyes, and the almost total absence of soft, feminine traits created an aura of detachment and unpredictability. Opponents looking at Isabella did not see the gentleness of a queen. They saw an aura akin to winter cold, hard, and betraying absolutely no emotion. In reality, her body carried no supernatural elements whatsoever. But that era always loved to twist abnormal physical forms into signs of danger. And Isabella, with a figure as gaunt as a shadow beneath black velvet, accidentally became the perfect embodiment of that fear. Isabella's emaciation at least served as a psychological armor. But for the final queen, the body was no longer an instrument of power. It was abandoned to the darkness, the dampness, and the bacteria, gnawed away piece by piece at the bottom of a stone dungeon. Number 9. Blanche of Bourbon, a body rotting in the dark. Blanche of Bourbon was once considered one of the most physically striking queens of the Castilian court. But years of imprisonment in damp, squalid chambers turned her body into an act of living decomposition. No sunlight, no clean air, no medical care. The cold, damp stone walls of her confinement created the perfect environment for disease to destroy a human body in the slowest, most ruthless way possible. Blanche's skin began to ulcerate due to chronic infections. Patches of flesh peeled from her face, untreated. The skin around her mouth and cheeks swelled red, then turned an unnaturally dark hue before cracking wide open. Over time, her facial structure began to deform. The features that had once been celebrated in diplomatic marriages gradually dissolved beneath inflammation and exhaustion. Late-life records describe Blanche's face as barely retaining the shape that had appeared in her earlier royal portraits. But the most haunting aspect likely lay in her hair and skin. Without care for prolonged periods, her hair became matted in clumps, reeking and tangling like damp rope. Her skin turned an ashen gray from severe sunlight deprivation, to the point where many parts of her body lost almost all the natural pink flush of a living person. Some descriptions noted that her fingertips were always freezing and tinged with a sickly purple. the result of prolonged physical exhaustion in a damp environment. The most terrifying part was that Blanche had almost no chance to ever see herself again. In the pitch black of her cell, she could only feel the changes through her fingertips tracing the rough, diseased skin that was slowly replacing the cheekbones once praised across Europe. No mirrors, no adequate light. Only a body slowly morphing into something utterly alien, right beneath her own hands. History usually only remembers thrones, wars, and political marriages. But behind the gold-gilded portraits are bodies distorted by disease, fear, and the crushing pressure of power. A limping step turned into mockery, contorted fingers viewed as the mark of witchcraft, a belly swollen from a tumor that made an entire kingdom believe a miracle was forming inside the queen's body. And sometimes, just a rotting set of teeth or a hollow gaze was enough for the crowd to conclude that someone had been touched by the devil. The horrifying truth is that the vast majority of these women had no idea what was actually happening to their own bodies. They lived in an era where medicine was too fragile to separate pathology from superstition, and any abnormality on the body could instantly become proof of sin, curses, or madness. And perhaps the most unsettling thing is this: many of the things once deemed marks of the devil, moral decay, or curses were, in fact, purely biological reactions that the era lacked the capacity to understand. Perhaps a few centuries from now, the humans of the future will look back at our era with a similar gaze, wondering how humanity ever believed that the methods, standards, or obsessions of today were perfectly normal. Among all the secrets just revealed, which detail haunts you the most? Leave a comment below and hit the subscribe button to continue uncovering the next dark secrets of history.